have an episode that puts the cult, no pun intended, in ritual, cult, and lore. But first, I want to introduce my esteemed co-host. She is the curator and the host of the fantastic project Rejected Religion, talking about none other than Stephanie Shea. So, Stephanie, welcome back.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me back. I'm very, very happy to be here talking about
Absolutely.
our lovely cult known as the Sherry Shriner cult. Although we've got to, I usually use the term new religious movement instead of cult, but because we're being a little, pop culture-y, we're going to use the word cult today. So
Absolutely. And I want to apologize off the top of the show that unfortunately my theme song is not as banging as Sherry Shriner's theme song. I could not find a copy of that for the show. I thought about doing it, but just did not have time.
I was
But
wondering about that.
Stephanie, yeah, we both have really nice theme songs, but like we just can't top Sherry Shriner no
No,
matter what we do.
unfortunately,
Um,
she's the best. I can't compete with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have a very special guest today. Um, and I'm very proud to have him be the inaugural guest on this new venture. So our guest this afternoon is Tony Russo. So Tony is a veteran journalist with over 20 years of experience. He wrote and hosted the narrative podcast This Is War, which documents the personal stories of veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he specializes in telling stories about small events that impacted the larger culture. And you'll see why this story is relevant to that very shortly. So, of course, as Stephanie said, our topic is Sherry Shriner and Tony's book on Sherry Shriner, Dragged into the Light, Truthers, Reptilians, Super Soldiers, and Death Inside an Online Cult is the topic of our discussion this afternoon. So, without further ado, Tony, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Looking
I've
forward to
I
this
I've
for a long time.
listened to that. I'm sorry that I didn't offer it, but I have hours and hours. I downloaded a lot of those blog talk radio shows of Sherry Shriner's, audio included, before they got taken down. What the really frustrating thing is when I sent them through the transcription machine, I had to pay to have, like, I would forget sometimes. I'd upload the whole thing and then I'd have to pay to have that song transcribed. It cost me an extra, whatever, 85 cents per download. So I'd be happy to share that if you need it.
Absolutely. I would love that. Just to have it on my phone so I can listen to it on my commute to work. So Tony, like many compelling stories and movies, we're going to start this one in media res. So I've adapted this introduction from an article in the New Republic by Jake Flanagan. So in the early morning hours of July 15th, 2017, Barbara Rogers shot 32-year-old Steve Mano in the head at point blank range in their township home together that they shared together. The wound was fatal. My boyfriend had a gun, she told a 911 dispatcher about 20 minutes later. He told me to hold it here and press the trigger. Oh my God, he's dead. Later, Rogers told police that the pair had recently been ousted from an online cult and that Mineo had become distressed as a result that he lost the will to live. So I'm going to stop right there and freeze frame. So Tony, what just happened?
Well, what just happened was weeks of essentially a flame war between that couple and Sherry, were mixed with drugs and alcohol to bad effect. I think I show in the book that and not only show in the book, I think they showed in court that Barbara didn't kill. She didn't shoot even. And that is, that's an important part of the story as it unfolds. But what happened was people got so wrapped up in Shera's reality that when they lost access to her reality, they didn't have another one to be in. And I suggest that Stephen was maybe not even killing himself, but looking for another reality to be in. the
Right. And this,
end.
and no, in this story, that's what I really loved about the book was it really pressed home. It's really about culture and the creation of realities and the type of everyday reality we ascribe to. Like you
Yes.
described Sherry and her followers going on these Orgon missions. Um, so you write in the book that culture doesn't happen to us. We build it as we go along, and you emphasize repeatedly that we're living in two separate realities. And I don't want to be on the nose here, but I think after the events of November, I'm definitely living in a different reality than a lot of people. But conspiracy theories have that aside, conspiracy theories have always been around us, but they ramp up at the start of the 21st century, especially in the wake of 9/11. And you write in the book that the attacks rattled people's beliefs in both secular and divine authority, and neither institution did much to try to win that confidence back. So it was in this combination of religious and institutional disenchantment and paranoia that Sherry Shriner, a nondescript housewife in Ohio, seized upon to proclaim her message. So tell us about this world of conspiracy theory that Sherry Shriner emerged from in these late 90s, early 2000s environment.
Sure. I think it's important to say that Sherry had been at it before 9/11, and she was, I think to say she was a hustler, and maybe even in the positive way, isn't unfair. She was looking for a way to make money without leaving her house. That was kind of priority number one. And so throughout the 90s, she bounced around through a couple of religious movements, a couple of takes on it's a lot of these religions have almost all of these religions have a multi-level marketing aspect to them. And that was something that really appealed to her. Get other people to send you money was her plan and goal. And she was not unsuccessful at it before she gained any acclaim. And she was, but she was struggling until she hit upon the triple threat of the lizard conspiracy, and Orgone and the Bible codes. Those were the three central tenets that attracted enough different people. And what's bananas about it is I believe many, if not most of her followers believed one or two. I don't think anyone believed all three of those things except for Sherry Shriner. But I think I put in the book this way, but I don't know if I've already said it like that. A lot of people who go to church, right? You'll say, well, doesn't your church believe? They're like, yeah, I go and I believe most of it. I believe enough of it to get up on Sunday and go, but I'm not going to stone the adulteress across the street. And that wouldn't change. Just because we think they're kooky doesn't mean that they're not following the same rules we are. What we believe, like I kind of view all religions very much, and all approaches to religion very much on the same playing field. Whether it's kooky or not is just in the eye of the beholder. What is important is what you're willing to do because of those beliefs. That's where I get nervous and interested at the same time.
So Stephanie, not probably people at home don't know, but the show is kind of Stephanie's fault. So I'm gonna let her take the reins.
Mea culpa.
Well, actually, it could be either mea culpa or you're welcome, depending on your perspective. But for me, it's thank you.
Yes, it is a little bit my fault because I had on my own platform, Rejected Religion, I had done a 3-part series on Sherry Shriner in the framework of occulture, how the occult has become ubiquitous in popular culture. And of course, within the whole umbrella of esoteric studies, esotericism and occultism, you have all of these different elements. It's not just one thing, of course. And new religious movements also fall underneath this, and especially the way Sherry had combined elements of all these different streams of belief. She had the evangelical side of Christianity, but she also had this Orgone narrative that's very esoteric. She was talking about shape-shifting clones, reptilians, aliens. So she had this paranormal side and this, all of these elements that I think I guess she crafted this whatever, when she was looking out into the landscape of where she kind of wanted to be herself, I think. And she was looking at what was popular, and I think she just, chose things that fit her narrative or that she could appropriate and just twist a little bit and make it fit her narrative. And it became this complex story that she just kept adding on to these more and more fantastical claims that she started to make, especially towards the end when she was talking about being the sister of Jesus and one of the original children of God, et cetera, et cetera.
I couldn't agree more. And it's something that we can see in we see in just regular kind of social media, this kind of leading from second place, where you look to see what's working for other people and you do that. I know that, I mean, for lots of the platforms that I've worked for, lots of the, different websites or whatever, they're like, oh, someone's doing this, we should do that too, because that is what's popular now. Now, I take great offense to that, because that I didn't get into this to rewrite other people's stories. But if I wanted to be a successful online marketer, that's precisely what I would have to do. I'm sorry, there are other ways to do it, but that's one way to be a very successful person. See what everyone else is looking at and let people confuse you for them. And I don't think Sherry was doing much more than that until she kind of leveled up to the point where she could say, no, this is me and this is my word. And then she could co-opt by accepting or rejecting. So if someone brought to her an idea like, well, is this person an alien? She would say, yes, they're an alien for this reason. And she would check the newspaper and see if they said any newspaper. She didn't check the newspaper. She would go online and she would say, yes, this person is an alien for this reason, or no, this person is not an alien for that reason. But she got to a point where she didn't have to actively co-opt. She could kind of passively co-opt and let her followers bring ideas and premises to her for her to accept and reject and add into the religion as was appropriate and necessary.
I guess Jason wants me to just take it from here. He's got himself muted. So, okay.
Well, you had a question about Nesara, and I thought that was a good segue to.
Oh, yes, of course.
After.
Yes, this I found this to be very interesting, and I was looking more into Nesara. This is the
reset.
Yes. Let me find my my notes here where I have all this written down. The National Economic Security and Recovery Act that you spoke about, Tony, is a set of proposed economic reforms for the United States suggested during the 1990s by private citizen Harvey Francis Barnard, but which were never introduced before Congress. So, Tony, I was hoping that you could talk more about this act and how it was appropriated by evangelical groups. I was personally not so aware of this Nesara Act. I was aware of the fact that 9/11, of course, was kind of the catalyst for a lot of conspiracy theories that came out after this event. But I didn't realize that this act was kind of like the impetus for all of these things. So, and it really interested me. So when we were speaking beforehand, you said that you had a lot of information about this. So I'm really interested to know all about it.
Yes, and let me plug my book for 2030. Because I've been toying with Nesara. When I was working on a Nesara story when I came across Sherry Shriner. So my original hope was to write about how religious scammers worked, and there's this one guy, and his name was Clyde Hood. And this is a movie that needs to be made. I don't know if you're familiar with the movie The Informant, but there was a movie called The Informant, and it was about a guy losing his mind because he was being like undercover, and he was working for the FBI, but he was lying to everybody. And it's a true story. And he brought down ADM supermarket to the world. This is very much like that. Clyde Hood wanted to make a couple extra dollars, plain and simple. He wanted to make, I think it was like $800,000 so he could retire. And so he got into this Nesara plan. And as a result, people started sending him money in like wrapped in aluminum foil so the government couldn't track it. And he was getting millions of dollars that he didn't know what to do with. And so he started giving out these no interest loans to everybody. So all of a sudden, this little town in Illinois, everybody has a boat. Everybody has started a new business. It was so crazy. And then the FBI came in, and took everything away from everybody when he was finally caught. But the Nesara was just a kooky thing written by a kooky economist. And I almost spoke with one of his daughters, but that she's tired of being asked about it, frankly. And she's getting up there in age. But this economist had this idea, and he said, what if we put together this kind of reimagining of how taxes work? And we will start by eliminating the income tax and replacing it with this. Everybody always wants to eliminate the income tax and replacing it with something that's fairer for them. That's just the American way. And this was his plan, but he couldn't get any real traction. So he went out and got 300 copies of it printed as a bill. So he wrote a bill that everyone could just read and sign and make law. And he sent it to every member of Congress with the idea that every member of Congress would say, oh, this makes sense. Let's just change our entire economic system. But they didn't. Most of them, I don't know how many of them read it. Those who read it, for the most part, ignored it. But that, and as in all conspiracy theories, the inconvenient facts kind of fall away. So this was technically a bill someone was trying to get through Congress. So if you say that Nesara was a bill people were trying to get through Congress, it's not untrue. But they'd never had any chance of getting through Congress, and there weren't any congressmen trying to get it through Congress. And so the idea was that there would be a reset, and then the government would be sending everyone who had shares in the reset like dividends. So it's so the idea was that you would invest in Nesara, and the government would invalidate the dollar and you would fund this new economy. And as an original funder of this new economy, you would get dividends on that. And the people who believed that sent lots of scammers. Clyde Hood was just one. There was a woman in the Pacific Northwest who went by the Dove of Oneness. Her name escapes me. Shari something or other. No, it couldn't be Shari. That would be too on the nose.
That would be very coincidental.
Shaney? No, I think it was like Shaney something. Anyway,
okay.
The Dove of Oneness. She's online. She's a trip in and of herself. She started doing it, and then Clyde Hood picked up on it, and he started doing it. And the Dove of Oneness was a hippie, but Clyde Hood was an evangelical, and he started doing tours of evangelical churches, getting donations for Nesara. And then he started, in a very multi-level marketing kind of way, having lieutenants who also could go and give talks and raise money for Nesara, and then kick up, and then kick up, and then kick up. And that was actually kind of his fatal flaw, because his earners were better at it than he was. So they were kicking up, they were also making millions and kicking up their percentage, but he didn't want as much money as he got. And that's the only reason he got caught. If he had stopped at 800,000, I think he probably would have been fine. I feel like he got to 3 million at some point. And this is like I think this is in the 1990s. I think this is pre 9/11, but it became a thing. And then when he got caught, his other people still went around and still were doing it. Because once the scam is out there, it doesn't matter how many scammers you put in jail. There are always more to take their place. And that is, I bet if you tried, I know that there was this guy in Barbados who was doing Nesara when I was writing the book, who I was trying to talk to. And again, they don't usually like to talk to people about it unless they're doing it from the pulpit. They're a lot more chatty from the pulpit than they are when they're on record with a skeptic. But so I think you could probably, if you had in mind, you could sell Nesara shares today and be quite successful at it.
So, as the evangelical preacher, what was the religious message then that was associated with Nesara?
The religious message was that God was going to help this happen. Like they needed to. It was thin. It was a very thin. It was. I don't want to be too direct about it, but these are the type of people who don't care what happens to their money as long as they think it's going to God, and that makes them targets. And they're hard targets to feel bad for, but they are easily targeted, because people of faith are easily targeted for that reason, because they have to have that, in addition to hope, they have to have that part of their brain that can shut off information that doesn't go with what they already believe. And this is very much back into the Sherry Shriner thing, because that is part of how you create your reality. You create your reality by limiting, or by turning on the damper, right? The information damper. By tight control of the information damper, you control your reality. And it's not, and we all do it. For example, I know 0 pop stars. I've never been much in the pops. Like, things happen in the pop world, things happen in pop culture that I'm completely ignorant of. And my wife will mention something and I will not say I have no idea, because I don't pay attention to that part. You only have so much time. I've decided that pop culture is not really something that I need to be a part of. I want to do my own thing, and doing my own thing means limiting my intake. So more Sherry Shriner, and then less, I don't know, whoever's popular now, Kesha. Less Kesha.
Okay. So I'm seeing here now then that the message that this Nesara Act would bring stability to the economy, a prosperous economy, that then this was coupled with the message that God wants America to be prosperous, and the Christians, his believers, to also be prosperous. Was that the message then?
Yes.
That was okay.
So Floyd Hood's pitch, which he recanted, was that, he was sitting in an airport one day and God told him to spread the word about Nesara and to start getting funding for it.
Okay. Right.
And I believe that his pitch was, once we raise enough money, the government can't not adopt Nesara. So if the shadow economy is pre-funded, then we'll just stop printing dollars and start printing Nesaras or whatever they
right. And in your research, did you find that Sherry Shriner was also talking about Nesara?
Early on, she was talking about Nesara. That was how I first kind of pinged her in my Nesara research, but I didn't look into her at all. Someone else, it's important for me to say that someone else pitched me the Sherry Shriner story. I don't want to give anyone the impression that I hunted this down all on my own. But I had been I had notes about her in her relation to Nesara. the book could have been 4,000 pages long. This woman was in so many crazy things. She spent some time in a community that I believe they called the Prophet Club, which was, again, kind of an MLM for prophets who would prophesize for one another and who would give one another access to the people who they prophesized for. They don't call it fortune telling because it's God, but that's pretty much what the gist was. And so when she was in the Prophet Club, a lot of those people were in Nesara proponents. And that's because they were either working directly for Clyde Hood or copying Clyde Hood. They were into the Nesara thing, and she was kind of in that clan. But she talked about the reset earlier in her early shows. Once she hit upon Orgone, then she didn't need Nesara anymore because it was a better MLM for her. Because it was more, I don't want to say more legit, but at least you got something, right? If she sends you a piece of Orgone, you have something that you can hold. And the fact that you paid an obnoxious sum for it is literally between you and your God. But it's less scammy, I guess. If you say, here's a magic rock, then give me money, and if we ever change economies, you'll get a dividend. So I think that's why Orgone was more successful for her.
Do you think perhaps that it also had to do with this story that was kind of wrapped around all of this? I mean, she already had the story about Wilhelm Reich, about, talking about Orgone and how the U.S. government came down on him, took away all of his research and put him in jail and all of that. And then, of course, she made her own little story about what Orgone was actually doing, then with the UFOs and the aliens and stuff. She could tie it into anything and everything. She could make it fit.
Yes, she absolutely.
And maybe that
could.
worked better for her than Nesara.
Well,
in that case.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think that's one of the, for lack of a better term, geniuses of genius aspects of Sherry Shriner, that she's living in this situation where you have all these elements around, but she synthesizes it in a very palatable way for the type of people she's going after. And she's taking the Orgon, she's taking the concepts, and then Orgone, as you mentioned in the book, Tony, was something that was supposed to heal, but Sherry inevitably, like everything in her life, turned it into a weapon. So let's get into the Orgon, kind of tell us about this situation.
Well, it's important to give Don Croft the credit that he's due, because that, more than anything else, allowed Sherry to be so successful so quickly. So there was this man living, again, in the Pacific Northwest, must be something in the water. And he was also a hippie. He was a hippie. His wife was a witch. And they used Orgone as part of their worship and as part of their own MLM. And what they would do would be, they would sell Orgone to people, and Don Croft would go around and give talks about, how Orgone helps, how it helps. And he thought of it as an environmental cleaner. So again, radio waves, these people love their radio waves. So this was going to protect you. This is how old it is too. This was going to protect you from radio waves, and it was going to heal the environment. He had special ones you could put in the water, and you could put them around, cell towers, radio towers, and then cell towers. But his genius was he created something that he called the Ethereal Warriors. And the Ethereal Warriors were a club of people who would write in and talk about their missions. So they would take their Orgone and they would go on missions, and they would place the Orgone. I put 7 things of Orgone around the electric wires on Route 12, whatever, right? And so that way they had a map of what was Orgone and what wasn't Orgone. The idea being that it was filtering out the bad stuff that was coming out of the towers it surrounded. Well, Sherry thought this was fantastic. And Sherry reached out to Don Croft and said, hey, God told me that we should work together, and that you and I should build this ethereal warriors group, and go on, to do God's work. And Don Croft's like, I'm not a God guy. I've seen you. You're absolutely off the rails. Now, it's important to not give Don Croft too much credit. Like, he claimed that he had cured AIDS with Orgone. Like, this wasn't like some nice hippie. This was a mean hippie. If you're stealing money from sick people, nothing bad enough can happen to you. This wasn't probably a great day to say that. But it's true. I'm talking about Don Croft, of course. And Sherry reacted by saying, okay, well, I'll just do it on my own. And so she started the Orgone Warriors, and she started sending them on missions. And that made all the difference, because people could coalesce around this. There was a very popular book at the turn of the century or in the late 1990s called something like Bowling Alone, right? And it was about how the death of groups, the death of fraternities like the Elks, and how people just didn't want to do stuff like that anymore. Well, going on Orgone missions is the best of both worlds. You get to be in a club, but you don't have to see any of them. You don't have to see their faces. You don't have to make small talk. You can online, but you don't have to deal with people if you don't want to, and you can still be a successful member of the club. And so that took off immediately for Sherry. And then the other thing that Don Croft did very, very well, and I think Sherry copied very well, is I'm not in this for money. Here's the recipe. You can make as much of your own Orgone as you want. Also, if you want, you can buy it from me, but you don't have to buy it from me. But I mean, who wants to make their own when they can buy one from a prophet, which is one of the ways that Sherry made a couple of dollars. I think she did okay on the Orgone, because it was hers. So it was more expensive than, if you just went out and bought some epoxy and made it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. You brought up a good point about the changing dynamics of social groups and interactions with the advent of the internet. Changed a lot on how people related to each other, how they became involved in things. It could be a little bit more impersonal as well. You could kind of stay in the shadows if you wanted to. I think Sherry, though, on the other hand, wanted to encourage a lot of participation with all of her followers, of course. However, if we could take a little bit of a step backwards, Sherry started with Bible codes.
Yes.
As you wrote. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Michael Drosnin, what was behind all of this. I thought it was very interesting that you wrote that Drosnin claimed that the codes were actually written by aliens.
Yes.
And that was a piece of information, that little nugget I did not know. I think there's a logical fallacy in Sherry's thinking with the codes. But before I get to that, I'd like to ask you, how was Sherry using this? What was she doing with these codes?
Okay, well, just very, very briefly. So this man wrote this book called The Bible Codes. He said that aliens had written the Bible and left codes within it for us to find. And I believe, especially in Michael Drosnin's case, that he started out honestly looking for something. And he stumbled across, references to Hitler. Always Hitler, right? And people took him seriously, like genuine academics took him seriously. And then they studied what he did. And it was one of the ways that they discovered that in any book over 300 words, you're going to find references that get tied back through history. It's a mathematical certainty because of the limited number of words that we use with any kind of regularity. It can be worked backwards, and like they did it with Moby Dick, I think was the first book they did it with, to just show that, yes, no, here's how that could happen. But it was a legitimate try. Then he said, well, you're only debunking this because you're jealous. and wrote another book about the Bible code. And also because it was very successful. Now, I think it was like 1995. It was, again, the maybe even the late 80s or early 90s. he took the premise behind the Bible codes and had it put into a computer program. So back when I was a child, I wasn't a child, back when I was a grown up with less gray, if you wanted a computer program, which used to be things that we put on, you would get a disk in the mail and you would load that disk up, and that disk would run the program. The program wasn't on the computer. And so he had one made where other people could use the Bible codes to find different references that are interesting to them or important to them, so they can use it like essentially like a personal fortune teller. You put this
Right.
in, and I mean, it's funny now to think of like the name generators, right? The children make them in high school in their spare time. This was essentially a name generator. And Sherry loved it because she could put a name in and then get a bunch of references and then build her sermon off those references. And she can just keep knocking in different names and seeing what the Bible code said and then turning that into her narrative for the week. And then she would do her blog talk radio, her blog talk radio spots, and just essentially riffing from the notes that she'd made when she put, I don't know, Hillary Clinton into the Bible codes. It would come back with all of these different references where Hillary Clinton's name was relevant in the Bible. It's one of the things that I say in the book, and I say it all the time in real life, is like, once you start making things up, it doesn't, a lot of times people want to ask why. And there are some, like, their point was there is no why, so we're making up our own. And it's important to, it's important to like keep your finger on that, because, I spent so much time chasing down, like, what's the real difference between the greens and the grays or whatever that the aliens are called. And I realized it was pointless because they're not there. Like, no one's there. The grays are not going to sue me for defamation because I misspoke about their true intentions in the hollow earth. Right. It's, at some point, what are you doing?
Right. Well, I think that with the this is just my personal opinion. I think that with the creation, I guess you could say, of these Bible codes, that Christians had, or Christians like Sherry, evangelicals, had a form of divination, whereas
Yeah.
other forms of divination were, taboo. You could, Christians were not allowed to use those things because those were occult tools. This was something that was sanctioned by Christians, saying that, oh yeah, God is speaking through these codes, and this is at least how Sherry was interpreting this, that God was speaking to her personally through
Yes.
these codes, and that's how she came up with many of her ideas, and some of them seemingly quite random, that there was all these connections between all of these different people and places, things, but that's basically how she started out. And then she also started to create into the narrative that the Orgone was also a part of this, that the messages were coming through about that as well from God, and that she started to then purport that these messages were not just something that anybody could do with the software,
Right.
but that God was speaking directly to her, and that it was, she was then the prophet, she was the mouthpiece of God. So all of these, over time, she started to change the narrative a little bit. And whereas this, as you said, it was a very popular thing back in the day, and a lot of people were looking into this to see, how does this work? How could I use it? And of course, Sherry being, I think she was quite ingenious in these specific ways, that she found things that worked, and she found things that people would believe. And so, yeah, in that regard, I don't know. I don't want to like give her credit in that regard, because I think what she was doing was harmful. But nevertheless, I think she was savvy in
Oh,
that regard.
absolutely. And what I really love about like the underlying the Bible codes are really just for me is it's a trope in a lot of, you know, supernatural movies and supernatural stories
Yeah,
where,
yeah,
you know, everyone's a fraud, the magician who really knows magic, right? The magician who's actually magic, right? And we have that in the back of our heads, you know, no, we know there are tricks, but are they?
yeah,
And I
right,
think that's what Sherry hit on. The yes, everyone's doing this, but God doesn't just talk to everyone. God's talking to me.
right.
And
Yeah,
here's why I think God's talking to me. And if he's not talking to you as much as he's talking to me, you'd be better off listening to me and not
right,
worrying so much about using your own Bible codes.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, and
I'll
she
And
tell
would
you.
that's
put
a theme
herself in
that,
that position. Go ahead,
yeah,
Jason.
absolutely. Like Stephanie said, that's a theme that comes up progressively and progresses to a huge
Yes.
level through Sherry's life, where she's
Right.
like, I can read the Bible codes this way. I have the true Orgon. That's the bad Orgon. I have the real Orgon. I have the real deal. All the way to the point where she's the sister of Jesus. And we may laugh at this as like some crackpot on the internet, and certainly she was just a lady kind of making it up as she goes along sometimes on these radio shows. She really does
Mm,
sound stream of consciousness at times. It has a lot
mm,
of collateral damage in the long run. We
Mm.
mentioned just a couple of those at the top of the show with Steve Mano and Barbara Rogers, but there were others, Tony,
Yeah.
who were, and this isn't, and the people who didn't die. There were people who were expelled from these groups who were,
mm.
if,
Yeah,
if you so much as like looked at Sherry the wrong way or didn't do what she said, she would use her prophetic claims to stick her people on
Sherry
you. So tell us about that.
Sherry would have been a better inventor of Twitter. What Sherry realized is that you can fill a lull with a controversy. You know, you
mm,
can fill a lull with some backbiting. So if the news is boring, you know, if you don't have anything to really go after, you can just speculate about a follower who maybe hasn't been kicking up enough and whether they're really a spy, you know, whether the
right.
government, because that was a big part of it. The government was constantly sending spies
Yeah.
against Sherry. They were
Mm.
constantly sending, you know, black helicopters to her house,
Assassins. Yeah.
assassins,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
of this stuff.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that keeps people engaged and supporting and sniping at one another at the same time. And occasionally she would choose a couple and pit them against one another and then against the group. It's what she did with Stephen, but she'd done it at least a
Mm.
dozen times before.
Right.
And
Right.
usually, oftentimes, the people would just leave. Sometimes they would feel cast out. One of the gentlemen that I spoke about in the book, Mike, you know, he was absolutely devastated by being kicked out of the cult. You know, he couldn't see why. And, you know, unfortunately, the answer was because his wife wasn't enthusiastic enough. And it has a very kind of Jewish matrilineal attitude came from Sherry. Like, if you have the woman, you have the household. If you
Mm.
have the man, you just have the man.
Right.
And it was important for her to have the women engaged. And when the women weren't engaged enough as part of a couple, they were ripe for the dismantling. The woman was always the did you ask me about the Jezebel spirit? Was that you?
Yes, and yeah, I did talk about that. Yeah, that's another topic altogether, actually,
Yeah, I
about the
know.
Jezebel spirit that has to do with conspiracy theories and Trump and Trump being God's agent, how evangelicals used Trump and still do use Trump as first he was compared to the pagan king Cyrus, if I'm not mistaken. I think that was his name. And now he's being compared to the biblical king Jehu. And Jehu was the biblical king who vanquished Ahab and Jezebel. So,
Ah,
whereas in the past, the Jezebel spirit was in Hillary Clinton. Sorry. This time around, it was Kamala Harris who was the Jezebel spirit. So
yeah, so Sherry
but that's
was
another that's
yeah,
another story.
but Sherry was very in tune to women who had the Jezebel spirit, and she would accuse a woman of having Jezebel spirit if her husband was more interested in the group than she was.
Right. Yeah, she definitely created a level of like a constant level of suspicion. Like everyone was suspicious of each other because she created this narrative about clones, that you could be easily cloned by the reptilians and no one would know. And
Right.
your closest family and friends wouldn't even know, those types of things. So everyone was always heightened, I think, at this level towards the end, of just really looking at each other side-eyed, like, are you really who you say you are? And should we really believe what you say? Especially if they came in with their own ideas like Kelly did, like towards the end, before she took her own life. She also had kind of this message that she claimed God gave to her, and I don't think
Right.
Sherry liked that at all.
Not at all, no.
So yeah, I think that's also an important point that you brought up. Something that I also wanted to kind of come back around to the Steve Mano aspect of this. I thought that your opening chapter, I believe it, let me look at my notes here. Chapter 10, you opened with the quote, "This isn't a story about crazy people. It's a story about vulnerable people being driven to the limit." And I thought that this, how you opened this, talking about religious belief and mental health, I thought this was quite poignant. And so I was, I also appreciated your comment when you said, we've all been there in one way or another. I mean, this isn't, although these are very out of the ordinary beliefs, a lot of people would, look at this story and say, these are a bunch of kooks. How could you be so gullible and to believe in all these crazy things? But how often, this really resonated with me. We've all been there in one way or another. We've all fallen, to somebody's scam or somebody's lie. We've all been duped at one point in our lives. And maybe it's not as, out there as UFOs and aliens and reptilians and clones and all of that stuff. But the fact that you could be lied to and you can, be fooled and you can be duped and you could be scammed. I think that's what you're getting. I think that's really important point. And I think also that many people who might know this story just on the surface, they've read things about it or they've watched a few news clips, that they might not realize or understand what led Stephen to do the things that he did, and what led to all of this stuff, this almost this manic attempt that he was going through to try to prove himself right, and prove that Sherry was a fraud, that he was going to all these lengths. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Stephen's background, and as well as these ousted members that you've already brought up. One of them, there was another one that they called Brother Rich in the group.
Richard Brown,
Could you talk more as to the what's going on there? I mean, they still believed in all of this stuff, but they didn't believe in Sherry anymore. And I thought that was very interesting.
Well, there's so much.
Yeah, there is.
I think that the shortest way to say they didn't believe in Sherry anymore is to, like, a lot of the chatter was like, maybe Sherry is a clone. Like, they could live with that, right? If Sherry's a clone, right? If Sherry's been taken over, that makes sense. Sherry didn't lie to them. Sherry couldn't lie to them. Everything else she told them was true. So if she was being mean to them or if she was doing evil, then it was clear that it was because she had been co-opted. And that is the greatest conspiracy theory of all time. The president is a Russian agent. We love stories like that because it just opens up, I think, a hole in our need to believe in something bigger. And when you open yourself up to that. If there's enough desperation, it doesn't matter what comes in. It's just the fact that it comes in. When I was researching this book, I spoke with a former professor of mine about it, because I couldn't get how people could go this far. And he told me something that influenced the book in ways that I can't even explain, and influenced my thinking in ways. And he said, think of them like alcoholics, right? Functioning alcoholics, most people don't know. Almost no one knows a functioning alcoholic. You know, they only know them when they drive through a school or whatever. Paranoids are the same way. And he referred to them as functional paranoids. You can be functionally paranoid, and no one knows that you're suffering from extreme paranoia until you shoot yourself in the head, blow up your RV on Christmas Day. For me, adding to that, what I've come to start to believe is that, just like alcohol, paranoia can have an addictive quality. Like, the reason that paranoids seek more scary things is to keep their paranoia level high. Now, I am not a doctor, but that so don't consider yourself treated if you're listening. But that is a way that has helped me to understand how people can just keep pushing and pushing. Because just as with alcohol, there is no down. There is lock yourself away and go through the DTs or whatever, but there's no, I'm just going to stop drinking tomorrow. Once you get to a certain point, paranoia, I think of as the same way. At some point, you either have to be put away or you go over the edge. There's not I think I'll stop being paranoid today because I know being paranoid is bad for me. There is we spoke briefly about Kelly, and if I could bring her up in this context.
Certainly.
So Kelly was a young woman who did a lot of work for Sherry, and then kind of broke with Sherry's thinking. And then Sherry started persecuting her. And then one night she went out and she claims she was going to help God get the keys to hell to start the apocalypse, but she had to be dead to do that. So we don't know. I don't know if no, I'm sorry. Clearly she died by suicide, but I don't know if she wanted to take her own life. I think that she had every expectation that she was going to wake up back in her body after going on whatever mission God had for her. But that's not why I brought her up. The reason I brought her up is she was suffering so much. One of the things that most evangelicals believe, and certainly Kelly believed, was that there's no such thing as mental illness. There's no such thing as drug addiction. They're all forms of demonic possession. And so she worked in like methadone clinic, or so she worked in a clinic, in a drug clinic. And one time she talked about looking and seeing that she was surrounded with all of these demons, and she wondered why. And then she remembered she didn't have her Orgone necklace on, and she put her Orgone necklace on, and then she was no longer afraid of all the demons that were surrounding her. That didn't make them not demons. It just, she felt protected from the demons because she was wearing this piece of resin around her neck. And that is how day-to-day paranoias, that's how day-to-day paranoids work in at least Sherry's orbit. When I spoke with Kelly's brother, he said when he heard that she'd taken her own life, that he was surprised but not shocked. Like, he knew that he obviously it's not obvious, but he would have done something if he truly believed she was in danger. She was likely to or capable of hurting herself. But when she did, she's like, well, I guess that is how it ended. You know, it wasn't, you know, I don't want to give you the sense that he was ambivalent in any way about it, but
No.
but he could see, like me reading the story, it's a goddamn tragedy, but you can see when you go, I read through so much of Kelly's stuff,
Mm.
and when you go through it, you can see the decline. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and sometimes I see the decline in people and they're fine, and I'm like, well, I guess, you know, I guess they got out of it. I guess they got it out of their system. But
Mm.
you know, her posts just got more and more intense
Yeah.
and more, you know, more and more interested in how the divine worked and what God needed from her as an angel in the flesh, which was another of
Mhm.
Sherry's terms.
Right.
And angels in the
Yeah, could
flesh
you
are
go into the angel in the flesh? Sorry to interrupt, but
sure.
the angel in the flesh concept is another locus of control that Sherry used
Yeah.
to kind of control her audience, so to speak. She
Mhm.
gave them a palatable, uh, and just to back up, I think that what you just said there about Kelly's brother, and reading the book, yeah, he really did troll Sherry, and he really did try to pull her out of it. But this is another situation where, again, the show is about we live in different realities, and we all tell each other a narrative. We all subscribe to a narrative. I subscribe to a narrative that I'm going to get up, I'm going to get on the train, go to work every day, everything's going to be fine. But what happens if I'm in a vulnerable situation and everything in my life sucks all the time? And you don't know why, no matter what happens. I listen to Sherry Shriner. Oh, it's not just because, this or this happened or I make poor choices. It's because I'm an angel in the flesh. And, I'm one of God's chosen because I'm being, that's why Satan is persecuting me. So
Yeah.
describe this concept because it really is something that Sherry used to kind of put her followers on a kind of
Yeah.
tier.
Yeah, and I think that this is, I've got to be honest, I didn't get through the Book of Enoch. I just couldn't bring myself to, but I think this is a Christian, this is a, what do they call the apocryphal book?
Mhm.
Yes, it's a
Belief
pseudepigraphical
that
text.
there was a first generation of angels who went down to earth
Mhm.
to start their own civilization, and there were demons who went down to earth to start their own civilization, and the demons had sex with the snakes and the pigs and the different animals, and that's why there are animals. It's really, it's complex in a way that only something made up by someone 3,000 years ago could be. And the idea in Sherry's um world was that if you're an angel in the flesh, then you're an eternal being who's constantly reborn as different eternal beings than Doctor Who, where your one life is over and then you start another life, and you're here on the ground to raise the army of humans and angels in the flesh to fight the reptilians and the demons in the final battle of the apocalypse, which is always next week. And that was the angels. That was the angels in the flesh. It's constant preparation for spiritual war. The generals, I guess, in spiritual war.
Yeah, the elite,
Yeah.
as she liked to use that word. Yeah, right. Um,
Yeah, it's bananas, right?
yeah, it is. There's
It's
so much going on there. Oh, I remember now what it was I wanted to ask you. You mentioned that you were talking about Mike, one of the ousted members,
right.
that his wife wasn't really on board with everything, and that things he started to, doubt things and have his falling out with Sherry. However, it seems like certain members didn't have that, um, what would you call it? The mania that Steven
Yeah.
had. And I think Kelly had in a different way. I think hers was this internal battle that she had with herself. She this eternal searching for the answers. She wanted to understand God. She wanted to understand this message. So for her, I think it was more an internal thing. With Stephen, I think it was this external thing. He was wanting other people to approve, wanting the acceptance. He wanted people to say you're right. You know, he wanted all of that validation. Yet you have these other members who were also out of the group, and they were just kind of like, you know, dude, it's you know, you just need to let this go. And even though they kind of they went along to it to a certain degree with Stephen about things about, yeah, maybe Sherry was cloned, maybe, you know, but they didn't seem to have that fervor that Stephen had. And yeah, I don't know. I think that there's a yeah, I don't know how to put this. I mean, you were talking about the, you know, the comment that you made about people leaving churches or leaving religion, and how this all takes a different dimension when we're adding Sherry Shriner into this whole discussion. I mean, what do you think about what do you think about Stephen? I mean, I don't know if there's like a I think it would be too easy to say there's like a formula that you could say, well, if you don't have a family, if you alienate yourself, if you do this, if you do that, if you follow all these little steps, then you're going to end up like somebody like Stephen Mano. I don't think you can do that. I don't think it's that cut and dry, but I do think there's this progression, I guess you could say, of someone who is maybe a little bit more vulnerable, alienates themselves, starts to become a little bit more involved in the group. They become accepted in the group. They think this is their life purpose. If they get a level of recognition, if they're being called a warrior or they're called elite, that this starts to play with their minds a little bit, and then things just start to go completely haywire. Pardon me. When when Sherry does seem to have this and I found this in the already in the documentary when you were discussing this in the documentary, how she seemed to have this tactic of just out of the blue, just letting people go, just cutting them off.
Right.
And this really had a tremendous impact on Stephen. And whereas with the other members, it didn't really, I mean, it affected them, of course. It wasn't anything that just left them, you know, like, well, I don't care. They cared, but it wasn't that same,
Stephen was
obsession almost.
Urgency. Stephen. Yeah. First of all, Stephen was what we would call today an incel. Right. And so that's an important aspect of it. But the other thing, and I don't think anyone alive yet is going to come to terms with it. And I don't like to be the one that keeps banging the 9/11 drum. But Stephen grew up not far from where I grew up, and that was within sight of the Twin Towers. And going back, I live in Maryland now, but going back to New Jersey after 9/11, it was shocking how quickly things kind of unraveled. It was a little demoralizing, honestly, to me, because all of a sudden everyone was crazy. And I remember pretty clearly walking in one day, and my dad was watching, you know, Bill O'Reilly, and my dad was borderline socialist. And I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, well, he knows, you know. And it's just watching, being there, and now I was living in Maryland during 9/11, so I wasn't there, and I think that was maybe fortunate because I had the distance from it to not have it destroy my belief. Everyone's reality changed, right? We went from a reality where we were safe to a reality where we were constantly under attack. And because we have binary thinking, that's we're either safe or under attack. You know, we're just not living our regular life with regular weird things that happen to us. So that was a big part of it for Stephen, because that drove him to the edge. And he was again, the original incel. He was on his computer. He was looking. I'm sure he sent around, for those of us who remember, there was a meme that said Microsoft was in on it, because if you typed 9/11, you got a plane and two buildings were the wingdings for 9/11. So Microsoft had something to do with it. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just appealed to him. And so now this is a crazy, I don't mean crazy, I mean very lonely guy, and he finds Barbara online and Sherry online, kind of through one another. And Sherry told him to move to Pennsylvania. Sherry gave him direction. And that was, she gave everyone else instruction, but she gave Steven a purpose, right? He was her journalist. He was her investigator. He was her confederate in the, in the survivalist trade, right? So he was made to feel like he was one of the most important members of her group. And it's important to say that until the very, very, very end, he was working for a reconciliation between Sherry and Barbara. He didn't want to not be in the group, and he didn't want to not be with Barbara. And that wasn't possible in this reality. And that was something that he just couldn't accept. One of the differences between him and, let's say, Mike, is Mike's wife didn't leave him over it. Mike's wife didn't say, that, well, no, it's me or Sherry, and Sherry didn't say it's me or your wife to Mike, but Sherry did say it's me or your wife to Steven, to Steven. And it was a decision he couldn't make. He wasn't a bright guy. He was really not a bright guy. And that meant that he had to hold on to all of the facts that he had, with the kind of desperation that you don't need to if you can find new things, right? But once he was locked into Sherry's reality and kicked out of it, again, he didn't have another one to go into, and he wasn't bright enough to create his own. He needed to be told what to do, and no one was telling him what to do.
And as well, he was alienated. He didn't have anyone else to fall back on.
No, it was just Barbara or Sherry.
Right. And I think that Mike even talked about that as well, that he had kind of cut all these people off from him when he was in the group, and he was, really,
his family, a lot of them cut their families out.
Yeah. So that it was hard for him to go back after the fact, when everything was over and he was out of the group, even though he still held those beliefs. He was not, in the group believing what Sherry was talking about. And he thought that,
and the group is an arm
from her pedestal,
Yeah.
But it was still hard for him to go back to his family and say, you know what, you actually were kind of right.
Who's going to do that? No one does that.
Right.
No one shows up at their mom's door with the bags and say, you know what, you were right all along.
Yeah.
It's easier to blow your brains out sometimes.
Well, this is why I'm always of two minds as, religious studies researcher. You're looking into new religious movements, you're looking into the motivations and the dynamics of these groups. And if, on the one hand, you think, if this is what people believe and they're not hurting anybody, they're not hurting themselves, what's the harm, But then you get into these types of stories with Sherry Shriner, and then other groups like Heaven's Gate, other groups, the famous Jim Jones, all of these things that, for whatever reason, these leaders are, not taking the responsibility that they should be taking with the very sensitive subject matter that they're dealing with, and also the sensitivity of the people. They're putting their trust and their faith in this person, and for whatever reason, this person just seems to run roughshod all over it and does a lot of harm. So that's why like I said, I'm always of two minds. This, the researcher side, you want to be academic and you're wanting to look at it from an objective standpoint, but the other side is like, this is just not right. What's happening here? These people are being really harmed.
Well, one of the things to kind of tie that together, and it's difficult to say because it doesn't fit easily into binary, but there's no such thing as harmless. And that's why it was important to me to talk about how we all build our reality together, right? And it's not harmless if you make a reality that I'm not allowed to live in. And so,
okay, that's different though. That's not what I'm referring to.
Right. But as for instance, a person who's not a person of faith, it's not only a radically different world, but there are things that I will never have access to because I'm not in that particular mode. Like my reality is not going to put me in a church on Sunday. And as a result, other things aren't going to happen as well. And I'm not talking in conspiracy terms, but for example, without hitting the abortion issue too hard, how harmless is religion in terms of abortion? How harmful is religion in terms of name the social ill? Name the social ill, and your beliefs, they are harmful. If you're all getting different messages from the same God and making rules about how I can live because of those messages, then just because you're not out in the woods chasing monsters and just because you're not blowing up buildings does not mean you're not doing any harm. I think you're doing irreparable cultural harm by the very act of not keeping your mouth shut and keeping yourself to yourself. And that is
right. Separation of church and state. If that was,
that's where it gets. And I didn't want to push back too hard on it, but that's why I thought it was important, especially since Jason brings it up, this idea of multiple realities and all of us building culture together. Because if we're not we're living in the culture we built together, and when people say, well, we're a very divided country, we built this this way because it's the way we wanted it. And whether we have the will, ability, and time to build something better and different and more equitable is the big question. But nobody put us here. We walked to where we are.
Yeah, I know. I take your point. I take your point in that. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And I always thought I wanted to bring Brother Rich up again because I love Brother Rich. I think that he's the one who gets out of the story the most unscathed. His YouTube videos that you describe in the book, he's talking about like how they're sending Orgon, they're going on these Orgon missions, and they're being confronted by reptilian super soldiers. And you look at the video, and it's just some guy like looking at them from afar. And it's like that two separate realities. I think you refer to it almost as like a cosplay, in a way. The community formation that these Orgon missions built was, in esteem. It can't be understated. I think that's what Steve is going through. That's what all of these people are going through when they're kind of excommunicated. It's not just Sherry. Sherry is the figurehead, but they build their identity through this community formation. And when that's gone, but Brother Rich was like, for me, was like, I always found him hilarious when I was reading this book. He's just like, I'm not a clone, I'm not dead, or I'm not in hell, or whatever. He kind of got away from that a little bit better than some of the others. But he's just a perfect example of like somebody who subscribed to a reality that was completely different from you or I if we watched those videos. Like, but some guy in the background.
But Rich was also a ground zero participant. He was maybe like a founding member. He was a very, very early Confederate of Sherry's, and one of the few people who'd been to her house, for example.
Yeah.
So he, my favorite thing to think about is what was it like at dinner at the Shriner household? Is that an FBI agent? Do you think the CIA poisoned the string beans? Did they really say that to one another? I don't know whether or not they did, but they could have, and it wouldn't have been weird. And that's something that I like to think about when Brother Rich talks about the time that the CIA poisoned him when he was having dinner. I don't know if that's in the book, but
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Poisoned him when
The
he was
black
having
bile. Yeah.
right dinner with Sherry. That and the
Yeah.
just this is what we're gonna do, and it's laughable. It's laughable until somebody gets
Until it
hurt.
isn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
until it isn't.
Mhm.
One of the people
Definitely.
that I did want to mention just briefly, because I want to talk about the Super Bowl, is MJ. And the reason that I think she's important. So this was one of Sherry's followers from way back, and she went on what we might legitimately call the only documented successful Orgone mission in the history of man. Sherry was told that the Super Bowl was going to be blown up, and that they had to have an Orgone warrior go out there and Orgone the Super Bowl. And so she did. She went out to New Orleans. She lived not far. And she put Orgone, like Sherry sent her a bunch of Orgone. People sent Sherry money to send her Orgone. So she had all this Orgone, and she puts it all over the stadium. And as the game's getting ready to start, or the second half is getting ready to start, all the lights go out. And I mean, how do you, and this woman genuinely believes she saved,
Yeah.
tens of thousands of lives, and billions of dollars. And I mean, prove to her she did it.
Right. Yeah.
The Orgone absorbed whatever the bomb was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And Sherry had those over and over again, those good bounces that allowed her to get, MJ did all the work, but Sherry did the prophecy. Wow, Sherry kept the Super Bowl from being blown up. So then later on, when she says that Barbara's going to kill Steven, and then Barbara kills Steven,
Yeah. Right.
you can't buy that kind of conversion propaganda.
Right. Is MJ still in the group?
In the group, as so much as there is a group, I would believe that she is. I've got to say, I stopped. I kept tabs for a while after Sherry died, and her sister and daughter started running the show.
Right.
They started repurposing her stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the good sides and bad sides, one of the everything that happened on Facebook. And because there was a murder,
Right.
everything on Facebook became part of the public record. So now we have all of this information about all of these people. And these are people that aren't really friendly to the government in the first place. And to find out that, all of their information is really I have all of MJ's information, and I'm just some schmuck. So they became a little bit less, if they're active, I don't know where. I guess.
Okay. And did you know anything about the successor, the Rachel? What was her name? Rachel, or she had another name. Can't remember. Let me look at my notes here. Rochelle or Rachel, Queen.
Yes.
They call her Queen Rachel now.
Yes.
Do you know anything about her? What's going on with?
I believe that's I lose track. It's either her sister or her daughter.
Oh, okay.
And so it was, it was kind of a family business. But a quick story about what happens when you put yourself into into crazy town is, I was pretty sure that Rachel was Sherry. Until I got her
Oh,
death
okay.
certificate, I was working on a conspiracy theory that Sherry wasn't really dead.
Faked her own death.
That it had been faked. And so Rachel was like I was pretty sure that Rachel was Sherry's new identity.
Okay. Yeah.
Until I got, like I said, I got her death certificate in the mail, and then I talked to the police, and they're like, no, we went up there and we couldn't
Right.
interview her. That's the worst part, because they would have had her at the trial, and that, I mean,
Mhm.
somebody good or bad, like if she was at the trial, someone way famouser than me would have gotten to write the book. That's for sure, because that would have been a shit show that you can't even imagine.
Well, yeah, I mean, that of course there's always that that question in your mind, but I also thought it was interesting that they said that Sherry wasn't uh or Sherry didn't die in the
Right.
natural way, but that God took her, because then if she died, then that would mean that Lucifer
Well, she's not
had
an angel in
won,
the flesh, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
she has to do
Yeah.
the Doctor Who thing. I wish I had
Yeah.
thought of that when I was writing the book. That would have been a
Yeah.
better analogy, I think.
The Doctor Who thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is reincarnation, it's kind of a strange thing that a Christian would be espousing reincarnation theories. So, but yeah, anything goes, it seemed like
Yeah.
It's only
with
strange
Sherry,
if
yeah.
it's past the 3rd century, Stephanie.
Yes.
Christians did that all the time before.
Exactly. Yeah, I was just wondering if you knew anything about the present day goings on.
No, I think they've probably gone their own ways and maybe gone back to church. Sherry had a cult of personality
Yeah.
that is not sustainable beyond her. I mean,
Mm.
she had the will, and she had the charisma. I mean, people listened to
Mhm,
that
mhm.
awful audio for hours and hours and hours,
Right.
because she had charisma, and you can't pass on charisma, and you certainly can't hand it off.
Right. Another thing I was curious about with the connections, in the book, you mentioned this other website or group called Almighty Wind,
Yes.
that this is an end times messianic Jewish Pentecostal group, which I found it's a mouthful. Was this independent of Sherry Shriner? Was this a related to her group in some way?
It was related is the wrong way to put it. They maybe kind of started together. They had the same target audience. They were competitors. They
Oh,
had
okay. So it wasn't like
similar.
offshoots or
No, they
anything.
had
Oh,
similar
okay.
beliefs. I think that, and this is foggy in the brain, but I feel like they were part of that prophet group that I had mentioned earlier, the Prophet
Yeah.
Club. I think that they were part of that whole project, I guess.
Right.
And so they were constantly fighting with Sherry for believers, because they were saying very similar things.
Okay.
And so they had to undermine each other.
Mhm.
Well, Sherry's not real because of this. Well, the mighty wind is not the almighty.
Yeah.
Have a
I
little self-awareness, for the love of
right.
God. We're trying to be serious here, and you're calling yourself the almighty wind, and it's really hard.
Yeah.
So
I understand. Well, I thought this was, like all the little threads are all connected together, but this group, I looked them up and saw that they were Trump supporters, and I know that Sherry at first wasn't a Trump supporter, and
that's
then
the
she kind of
biggest
changed
one. Yeah.
her opinion about that. And then there's, all the conspiracy theories around Trump, the QAnon, but also, all this stuff about evangelicals bringing the biblical narratives in, as I mentioned this briefly before. It's just like you can just keep digging, and you'll find more and more and more
Yes.
things that are like, somewhat related or directly linked, or it's just never ending story.
That's why I mentioned before, I didn't even know if I told. There are so many stories that are
Yeah.
still left that I didn't have room for, or that just they didn't. There's like, it was more like being like, here, this is cool, but you want to respect people's interest, and you want to keep the word count down when you can. but yeah, there wasn't. I mean, there wasn't anything. There are so many more stories because they're all just different people,
Right.
and they're
Right.
different. And I think that's the other really interesting part is it's a perfect mix of people who are just dying to have some assurance and some acknowledgement of their faith, and people who
Mm.
want to make money off that, and they're
Yeah.
finding one another. You know, if that's what the internet
Mhm.
did, it let them find one another. It
Mm.
let the wolves find the sheep. I guess is another way to put it. But that's another knock on it. It's that when you take advantage of, you know, the belief is one of like our core abilities, you know, and when you turn that on a person, it's one of the most vicious things you can do is to betray someone's belief, um
Mm. Yeah.
because those are the things that make us people. You know, those are what our connections are all made of. And so in Stephen's case, you know, when he had his belief forcibly removed from him, there was nowhere for him to go, because
Yeah.
he had experienced the ultimate betrayal. Like,
Yeah.
his world was not real in a very literal sense.
Yeah. That's the absolute tragedy of Stephen's story, of Kelly's story. Um, yeah, I find that Sherry, like I said before about being sensitive to, to the
Yeah.
people that you're supposed to be leading.
Yeah.
I felt that she wasn't sensitive in that regard at all.
No.
So that's as outlandish and out of the box that all these different conspiracies and all the different ideas and all the different themes and motifs that were put in, that people would just kind of shake their head and say, this lady's cuckoo, for Cocoa Puffs. There is still this human side to this story that I find that's why I'm also of two minds. It's one thing
Yes.
to have just kooky beliefs, okay, whatever, okay,
Right.
people, whatever. But when it starts to affect people in such negative ways, that's when I start to think, ugh, why? What was this? What was this all for? And if it was all for money, then that makes it even
I
sadder,
know.
So,
Well, I mean, if you want to, if I don't have pity for Sherry, but you know, she was doing the best in the world she was born into.
mm,
You know, her husband probably wasn't a great husband. And
right.
he's alive, and that's all I'm allowed to say about that. And her father probably wasn't a very good father. He's dead, I can say that.
Mm.
And that shaped the way she reacted with the world. And
Definitely.
she had to find a way to feed her kids and
Mhm.
herself in a world where she was trapped in the middle of nowhere, and you know, had no recourse. You know, there was no recourse for her to earn a living except in this way, or in, you know, in a way similar. And
Mhm.
so that's, it's at least worth saying that she wasn't just bored one day and said, "Let me betray everything I believe and everything everybody else believes." You know, she
Right.
got there, but that wasn't, I don't think, where she initially hoped to
No.
go.
No.
So
Jason, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I think I didn't want to interrupt because this has been a great conversation, and very happy to play the third wheel here, Stephanie. Especially I was telling Tony before we did this, I'm like, well, Stephanie's the one who's actually disciplined and knows her stuff, but I'm just like,
right.
but I think
Thank
she's
you.
handled it fabulously. So well done, Stephanie. But
Thank you.
I think what we probably should end on, because I know Tony, we agreed about an hour and a half. We should probably end on, yeah, this is a crazy story, with lots of strange ideas. I think Sherry, if anything else, was a person with a huge imagination, where Even in, like you mentioned, Tony, even an innocuous thunderstorm could be like an attack from the NWO or whatever.
Right.
But
Yes.
whereas most other people would write like fantasy novels in their spare time, Sherry kind of created this world of paranoia and fear and
Mm.
hatred. So, but what is this
Sensationalism.
ultimately saying?
Yeah.
And we've been touching upon it a lot. Like, it's easy to laugh at this. It's easy to just look at this stuff and go, "Oh, those people are crazy," instead of looking at the human dimension. And this isn't fringe. I don't want to get too far into it, but I think that what the past month and a half has shown me is that I'm really not in touch with what my neighbor thinks. And there really is what you're talking about, Tony, in terms of that realities being built side by side. And sometimes especially in the case of somebody like Kelly and her friends and her brothers who cared about her brother and her friends who cared about her deeply, those two different realities don't seem to match. And we think that everything's all right because we're subscribing to a version of reality and we take for granted that everybody else is. But
Right.
so what does this say about where our culture is at? What does the story tell us about how seriously we should take these, for lack of a better term, fringe theories? Because it doesn't seem to be as fringe as we want to believe anymore.
Oh, well, yeah. And
so.
at the risk of being super self-referential, I think one of the lines from the book is they believe this the same way you believe whatever you believe, and anything that any of your beliefs, especially metaphysical ones, aren't even more valid than theirs. And it's hard to, it's critical to remember that. It's critical to remember that if we're going to play in the belief game, then there are going to be belief accidents. One of the many people that I stole from, but maybe someone that's a little a little unexpected, is there's a short story by Stephen King, and it's called The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet. And I took from that I learned in that book a good way of talking about this. And so I'm not going to reinvent it. He did a better job than I did. And he said, he had one of his characters say, that in everyone's mind, there's a room, and in the room, there's a table with a gun. And when we're walking down the street and we see a ladder and we say, it's bad luck to walk under a ladder, well, it's also not bad luck to not walk around the ladder. We open the door and pick up the gun. And then we walk around the ladder and then we put the gun back down and we leave the room. But eventually you start to believe that you need to go around town knocking down all the ladders because it's causing the town to fail. Like the tax base is crumbling because people are putting up ladders and people are just walking under them willy-nilly. And that's when you pull the trigger. That's when you've gone into the room and pulled the trigger. And I think would do well to be very sensitive to know that we're all in that room a lot, and that pulling the trigger is not as far away as we think. And I've just tried to, ever since coming in contact with, I call them the Shrinerites. So ever since coming in contact with the Shrinerites, I've tried to be very intentional about my own beliefs. And while I don't ever challenge anyone on their beliefs, I don't engage with them either. I think that if my mother had run the culture and everyone had listened to her and ignored them and they would go away, they would have gone away. But we can't ignore them. We have to poke. We have to poke at the strangeness. We have to poke at the sensationalism. We have to. And then we wonder why there are more. If you teach people like Sherry that we can make a living by getting people worked up, then more people are going to get worked up and make a living at it. And so if you want things to get better, stop clicking. Like my solution is, if you see something awful, pointedly do not click on it and pretend it's not there. Ignore it and it'll go away. We've tried everything else. So that's, I mean, it's not a happy ending, but it's the best one. It's the best one I can do. I put myself in my little room. I write my kooky books about my monsters in the closet, and I don't engage with them except from a researcher or a reporting kind of I pointing and laughing or clicking is at least 50% of the problem. It could be 60% of the problem.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you have a point there, that the negative attention that these types of groups receive, that's not, like you said, balanced, well thought out. How thinking about how you would respond to somebody who comes up to you and starts talking to you about all of this. Yeah, I think there is something to be said for that. Measuring your words, weighing what it is that you're going to say beforehand, if anything at all. Yeah.
They live for the mockery. They live to know that you are an agent of Satan sent to torture them.
Yeah.
It solidifies their faith that they are right because they're being persecuted. I read another interesting book called The Midnight Kingdom by Jared. I believe he's a famous podcaster, but his name is escaping me. And one of the things that he had talked about in that was that in Roman times, they actually stopped torturing Christians because they were just bored with it. It was the Christians enjoyed being tortured too much, and they enjoyed the proselytization that it gave them. They needed the press. They needed someone. Look at this person of faith being tortured by the Romans. And then one of the emperors was like, yeah, why don't we just knock it off? Maybe that will help. Like, torturing them isn't making them go away. So
no, it's actually feeding.
Right.
Feeding the narrative. Yeah.
Probably shouldn't have thrown Christians to the lions. That was mistake number one.
Right. Okay.
Well, let's let's wrap things up here.
Okay.
So Tony, I want to give you this time to plug whatever you'd like to plug. I know you have a great Substack where you write on various topics. You have books, a podcast, so whatever you want to, wherever you want to direct people. I also have the book link in the comments.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. You can go to buytonyrusso.com. That's BYTONYRUSSO.com. And that's where all my stuff is. I do occasionally use Instagram, which is also by Tony Russo. And if you are a listening person and you're listening now and you were already a member of Audible, the audiobook is only one credit. So if you'd like, I read the audiobook. I produced it here. I think I did a good job, and it's outsold my regular books. So people seem to like the audiobook very much. And also the book, I like to mention. I don't like to mention. I never mention it, and I'm just afraid one day my publisher is going to come and burn my house down. I did win an award. It was a silver medalist in the Independent Publishers Award, which is a legitimate award. It's not one of the ones you buy. It's small presses and university presses. So I never mention it, and he always does. So I feel like I should start, but I also feel very braggy to mention it. Like, I won an award 100 years ago for a book that no one read. So,
well, congratulations for winning that award.
But yeah, that's it. By TonyRusso.com. I write about all sorts of. Right now, I'm doing a object history project where I'm trying to find out where these pens came from. I have a particular set of pens. I'm looking at their origin. I have a war memoir in the works, hopefully for next year, that came out of that. This is War. And then after that, I've got a couple more murder books on my desk that I'm hoping to get off in the next 2 or 3 years.
And
Okay.
that Nesara
Exciting.
book too, right?
Yeah. That one. So just real quick, the Clyde Hood happened in the town of the lead investigator. The guy who got, the FBI guy who got the assignment lived in that town. So he was permanently undercover because he knew they were doing an investigation. So he'd be like sitting at the bar and somebody would come in and say, "Hey, I heard you got money from Clyde." Like, "Yeah, Clyde gave me $12,000. And this poor guy's got to be like, "Eddie got $12,000 from Clyde," and now he's got to put all of his neighbors in jail. It's bananas. Absolutely bananas.
Wow, that is a story. You got to write it.
Oh, it's on the list. I spoke with a federal judge who was afraid of them. He's still afraid. He's a federal judge. He's still afraid of Nesara. They're for real. So, or they were for real 6 years ago.
Looking forward.
Okay, I'll stop now because I'll keep talking. If you keep the camera on me and you don't speak, we'll be here till dark.
Well, lots of exciting stuff to look forward to, it sounds like. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us once again. It's always an honor to have you join us on the show, and I always enjoy your work and your interviews. Feel free to use this time to plug where people can find you and your work, because you've been doing some really awesome stuff lately.
Yes. Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure to talk with Tony. I'm so happy that you set this up, Jason. Couldn't have thought of anything better to do than to talk more about Sherry Shriner, because it was, I mean, she was really kind of, a major point of my focus for a long time. As I'm sure it was even more with Tony. So it was nice to be able to talk about it.
Tony,
So,
you'll be happy or horrified to know that when Stephanie first did this deep dive into Sherry Shriner, I was like, my mouth was open half the time. I'm like, this is so familiar yet so out of this world. So I had to like buy your book. I had to watch all the podcasts and the 4-part series or 5-part series on it. She meant, like, Stephanie mentioned it like I think you mentioned it on a Thursday, and by the time the first show came around, I'm like, oh yeah, I read all the stuff that I watched. All the stuff. I don't know, just something about it was like very strange.
Yes, I'm super grateful for the opportunity. Recently, I've started a Patreon for myself, for my platform, and it is. I think it started in August, I believe, if I recall correctly. There was so much going on in my life at that time that it's all kind of a jumble in my memory. But yeah, it's only been running for a few months now, but I'm enjoying it very, very much. You can find me at rejectedreligion.com. That'll take you to all the different places. I have a podcast as well. Patreon, I do monthly content for each tier. And yeah, really enjoying doing all of that, and was super stoked when Jason became a Patreon and was becoming involved in the live Zoom meetings. And so yeah, I've just really trying to, at this point, I've been doing the podcast for about 5 years, but now I wanted to expand a little bit more and start doing some other things and more content. And yeah, next year I'm going to be starting a book club on the Patreon. We're going to be reading a lot of different academic books, but not the dry ones. These are going to be the fun books. So we're going to be reading those, talking about those. I'm going to be, doing collabs with other people as well. Got a lot of talk right now. I can't really talk a lot about it, but there's a lot of background. The background. There's a lot of stuff going on. Hopefully, I'll be able to make some announcements soon about that. But yeah, this was just a joy. It was such a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk with you both. And yeah, I'll just shut up now too. So otherwise we'll be here for another hour.
Yeah, check out Stephanie's Patreon. It's got all kinds of, you want to know anything about monster theory and Lilith to the simulation universe, all kinds of really interesting
Yeah.
guests
And
and topics that
burrows and chaos
yes.
magic and oh gosh, what else were we talking about? Demonology and hyperstition and just everything, just all kinds of goodies that are under that large umbrella of esotericism, all the good stuff.
Absolutely.
The wonderful
Well,
weird
thank you.
stuff.
Yeah, it's a fantastic show. Well, thank you both so much for being here. I